We're going to go on and get started now with the Your Day production of the continuing conversation with the panelists. I want to welcome all of our panelists back, and I'm just going to, in case you don't know, you on the camera, we've got our legislators and our senators on this side, and we've got our business community and industry community on this side, also the providers and of water as well as electricity. And we want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us. And if I happen to point to you and say your name, that's when we'll be doing our introductions. But first of all, I again want to thank you for staying around. I'm Donna London. I'm with the Jim Self Center on the Future at Clemson University. And I have to tell you that over the last 6 years, I have been attending these sessions, and they're very optimistic and they're very informative. And even for a layperson like myself, I learned so much. And so I know that all of you have very vast responsibilities. But I have to say, we've been talking about water planning for a while, and I'm not going to say that nothing's been done, because I know that there's plenty that has been done, and that we've also gone through some extremely challenging times. And so if I could just get a sense from you, what is different about this year, 2014, from 2006, the first water conference, 2008, the first water conference that I attended? And maybe if we could start with you, Senator Campbell.
Yes, ma'am. I think I guess I need the mic.
Yes.
You know, one of the things that we did last year, we put money in the budget for DNR and DHEC to work together on some planning, and we also funded something in the proviso to help them bring in a resource so that they can get feedback from all the stakeholders all over the state. I think that's something different than last year. We actually have some funding that we can go forward with. It may not be adequate, but it gets us started, and I think we can leverage that with federal monies as long as we can get the federal monies. And we can do that, and we can probably drive forward with it. But we do have some money behind it now, and we do have the people involved. And I know that both Danny and the Ag and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate, and I know that Nelson and the Ag, Natural Resources, and Environmental in the House are pushing this. So we're going to see if we can't make sure DHEC and DNR go forward with it and come back to us when they need resources.
Senator Verdon, the same question for you, except that we were talking earlier, we heard you say earlier about the need to grow our economic resources and to really focus on economic development. And there's a sort of a chicken and an egg question there as to how do we grow our resources if we don't know what we have and if we can't provide assurances to our recruitees?
Well, I think there should, and I think you rightly observe, an optimistic outlook conference to conference. What's different 6 years from 2008? Well, we have an established law that's working. As Senator Campbell just said, we now have incremental funding from the General Assembly to establish the resource, to measure the resource. If the regulators, if the agencies responsible, DHEC, DNR, are successful in assimilating the stakeholders and accumulating the data, there'll be a favorable report to the General Assembly, and I believe we'll be successful in securing additional appropriations to continue and complete the process. Economic development in South Carolina. Historically, we thought we had to build a ready-made industrial park, say, in a rural community where jobs were scarce. Well, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I can take you to many places in South Carolina where there's sewer, water, rail, electricity, everything necessary, but still a bare piece of ground. It's not there. Well, there's a bigger macro dynamic at play. But if there are other factors that come into play that would enable or sponsor jobs there, at least the infrastructure is ready. Can we afford necessarily to have it ready at every rural crossroad in South Carolina? No, we can't. The utilities have already raised the question of how are we going to replace 100-year-old infrastructure. Someone came here during the program and said, well, in response to you saying the structure is already in place for the ratepayers to pay it, they're paying $1.49 for a half liter right now, 1,000 times what they pay for it at the tap. We will pay what we believe is vital and necessary to prosperity and growth. I think we corporately, as a society, as a state, will do what's necessary to make sure that we have prosperity and growth going forward. But it will cost more.
Sure.
We will have to invest.
Sure. Senator Hayes.
Well, thank you. I don't want to be redundant with people because I think they've done a good job of kind of outlining what's the big change, I think, was the surface water permitting that has changed since the very beginning of water conference until now. Permitting and the regulations, and now the money for the testing to evaluate the different water basins, et cetera. That's important. I think that it's noteworthy that probably since the beginning of this conference that the states are working better together. I think we settled a lawsuit with North Carolina. We've got a working interbasin study there on the Dakota Watery. I think Representative Bowen has talked about what Georgia and South Carolina are doing along the Savannah. So I think there's more interstate cooperation than there was at the beginning. Certainly on renewable energy, I think we've taken steps in that area that have changed, with the solar that passed this year and what some of our utilities are doing on renewable energy. That's going to have an impact on water. And I think that we've seen some of your issues on farming that may have changed some as far as your large farming, et cetera, that we'll have to look at. I don't think anything is going to move too rapidly in that area, but I think it's something we need to look at some point. So those are just some of the changes that have happened over the last few years that I think is going to have an impact, that has had an impact on the changing environment here at the conference.
Representative Hardwick, I'm going to switch the questioning just a bit and ask you about, within your response, if you can speak to the rivers and the streams and the water resources in South Carolina as part of our state infrastructure. We talk about the importance of keeping and I know that we're talking about hard infrastructure, but it is part of our system. I guess you could say it's the blood of our system. It's the skeleton of our system. And it provides the foundation for so many other things that come with it.
Yes, we have the area, we rely heavily on water, in our rivers and streams. We take it out to drink, and we dilute our waste. We have a tremendous fishing, hunting, and other aquatic animals that depend on us to keep the concentration levels where they need to be. So I think that what we've grown in the past several years in gaining a better understanding of what we have and how we can better manage it. And the public is learning a lot more about what they can do. And I think all that pulls together, and people keep coming to us and demand that we do a better job, that we learn more about where we are and where we're going. And I just think that those resources are beginning to get out front where people can better understand what they can do individually, because we all are the keepers of our environment.
Right. Thank you, Representative Hardwick. And also, Representative Hyatt, like you, I'm in Pickens County, and fortunately we have abundant waters. It just happens to be in our backyards rather than in the places that we need it. But I want to ask you, particularly in the lines of water planning, what are the policy issues that need to be addressed over this next legislative session that will ensure that we make headway?
I think the key thing is that we make sure that we know what we have. We know where we need the resources to go. I think we obviously know that utilities need them, Farm Bureau, the agriculture industry needs it, a lot of different industries need it, but we need to make sure that once they have what they need, then we also understand that we make it available to the public for public use. I mean, in Pickens County, obviously, we've got a lot of area used for hunting and fishing and just basically sightseeing, so to speak. And that's very important to a lot of people. I think one of the key things that we as legislators have come to realize is that conferences like this, where we can sit and talk to folks who on a daily basis are responsible for the production, the use of these resources that God's given us. When we can hear from these folks and they can tell us, hey, look, here's where I see an issue coming up in the near future. The older gentleman that spoke a while ago said he's 87 years old and it took him this long to realize that we can't see 5 years down the road. Well, I'm not quite 87, but I've come to that conclusion myself. But we can come to the conclusion that there is a need. There's always going to be a need. We've got to prioritize what those needs have got to be. We obviously got to take care of our utilities and the farmers and the folks that need it to provide us the everyday luxuries that we enjoy in life. But we also got to understand that we've got to put in place a way to conserve some of these resources, a way to make sure that our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren will have the same abilities to enjoy them just like we do. That when they go to turn on the faucet, the water comes out. We got to make sure that the infrastructure's in place. These leaders on the panel with us, they're telling us that it's so expensive for the infrastructure. We understand. Consumers understand that. But they also understand that when their rates go up, they're going to call one of us and complain why did the rates go up. So we've got to find that balance to where we provide and we conserve and we give industry, agriculture, the things that they need, as well as we also leave enough for the public to use for their enjoyment. And that's a fine line that but our main concern is that we provide the people drinking water, electricity, whatever they need for the use of water. That's our main concern, I believe.
Thank you. And Representative Bowen, you've attended these conferences over the year and you've heard the discussions, and you certainly know all of the, like many of you, know the different conflicting interests and the reality of where we stand in terms of a state and the fiscal resources that we have or do not have. I'm wondering from your perspective, given that we understand the expense and the long-term nature of putting together a plan, it's not something we can hand off to somebody else to do. We all have to be involved. But has there ever been any discussion that you know of where we've talked about combined funding for such a plan, where we might use perhaps utilities to assist with that, and what the issues are with that, or perhaps since there was discussion about fees earlier and how we needed to be considering fees, that we might consider that, since there is concern about raising taxes.
Well, there's one thing that I've been working on about going down into Georgia and meeting with their group and putting them together. I hope that we develop a rapport so that we can share both states' resources with regard to the technology that we accumulate. And if we can work, Georgia right now has been in lawsuits with other states to the tune of about $20 million trying to resolve issues. We hope that we can circumvent getting into lawsuits. I know there may be some issues where that may have to be the only way that we can resolve those, but there's a great preponderance of the issues that are put before us that if we sit down at the table with our neighbors, that we can resolve without doing that. So if Georgia did that with the other states that they're in lawsuits with, they could have freed up about $20 million to work on infrastructure. Now, you were talking about the water planning and putting, how is it different this time from in 2008 when you first saw it? Well, the first time, and the thing that I noticed about the water plan was that it had a lot of great ideas, and they've worked hard on putting those ideas in a booklet form, but it lacked the legislative teeth that it needed to make those ideas be implemented in a timely manner. So now that we're all working more closely together, we can help them because we're communicating now. And that's extremely big in helping us move forward with the water issues that we have.
Well, and I want to get back to you folks momentarily. I want to hear from you what your thoughts might be on combined funding or fees or something that would push this forward. And I may get shut down very quickly, but let's hear from this side of the table. And again, I want to thank you for joining us. And Mr. Penland, you mentioned that that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And I'm just coming back from California, wine country, and also seeing what's going on in North Carolina and Asheville, and even here in South Carolina. Whiskey and beer and wine, all of those require that water too. So
That's true. That is true.
one of the things I wanted to ask all of you is, without an updated plan, what are the implications for your companies and for understanding our energy future, understanding our agriculture future? I understand that within each one of your organizations, you already are doing quite a bit of planning, but from a statewide level, you're not seeing what the other elements are that will affect your needs for your customers, as well as the needs that may affect your industry in general. So if I could start with you, David Winkles with the South Carolina Farm Bureau.
Well, thank you, Donna. You know, the comments earlier on planning were interesting, and you know, none of us know what the future is. Obviously, don't with the challenges that we see on a worldwide basis, whether it's terrorism or disease spread. We don't know what the world population will be. You know, we really feel like we need to create a lot more water impoundments. We need to make it easier rather than more difficult for water for farms. That's one area that the Corps of Engineers, of course, is in charge of, and we find that we're finding mixed answers. You know, I mentioned earlier, we've seen lawsuits on both sides of that issue. So it's really kind of tying our hands. I don't want to ramble, but I do want to make a couple comments. The comments on a cooperative, comparing it to the rural electric cooperatives and the rural telephone cooperatives, was quite interesting. And I guess what stuck with me on that is that the society we live in today is very demanding. You know, I made a comment that I hope I don't look that old, but I do remember when we got our first telephone. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't one that you turned the crank, but it was around 1952 or 53. I was about 4 or 5 years old, and you know, from that time forward, we had one black telephone with a rotary dial in one location in the house, and 17 people on a party line. How many people would put up with that today? What would our friends on the other side of the table here be looking at? So I look at that, and again, I don't want to ramble, but one of the things I think we all have to realize is that one day, somebody will ask for a permit for withdrawal, and the answer will be no. And that's something that we all have to plan for. And, you know, what's the public reaction going to be to that? You know, right now, I know my neighbors in the subdivision want to water their grass every day. In fact, I saw a sprinkler system running this morning. Mine wasn't, but theirs was. So dealing with the public and dealing with these, I think, you know, looking back to, you know, what's different in the last 8 years, the public becomes more demanding as we move along, whether it's the choices they have in food in the grocery store, whether they demand for it to be locally grown versus grown in California. You know, I can keep the lights on in the house so I can run my security system at night, or I can keep all the outside lights on. But the public is becoming increasingly demanding and less tolerant. So that's, I guess that's where I'll end it, Donna, and that's going to be a challenge for all of us to determine, you know, what's the most important. Is it most important to see that river at the flowing at 100% capacity 100% of the year, or is it acceptable to maybe be at 50% for some of that time? You know, we definitely need to work with our state partners. We need to get our act together, because again, as I've told our folks, one day that permit or the registration will happen, and or paperwork will be filed, and the answer will be no. There's not enough.
Dyke Spencer with the Powdersville Water District. I think I've got that right. Excuse me, I'm trying to talk quickly to get this in, but I'm from the South, so it takes me a little while to get it out. But anyway, you brought up a number of points in your discussion about perhaps some controversial points about system consolidation, as well as particularly looking at combined funding as well. Without a plan in place, how does your operation continue to work, and what do your customers say, particularly when you get new customers, as you're in a very fast-growing area of South Carolina?
Well, I think my biggest concern about going into the future, we're at a pace right now in this state where we're bringing economic development in at a record pace right now. I mean, it's incredible what's coming into this state and the size of manufacturing facilities. In Anderson County, we had a $1 billion investment in first quality tissue, and they're using 6 to 8 million gallons a day right now in Lake Hartwell. Lake Hartwell's why they came. Ain't no doubt about it. That's why we got them in that county. Thrilled to have them. How many of those can we put on Lake Hartwell? I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows. So I'm gonna feel a whole lot better when we've done some sound science that I was talking about earlier about looking at each basin, knowing what that gap analysis, that's saying here's how much is coming in, this is how much is going out, this is what we've got left, this is when we're gonna run out. I'd like to know those answers, and I think our government needs to know those answers, because we're going to find out that we're water rich and we're water poor in different parts of this state. And we probably don't need to be recruiting first quality tissue on certain places in this state. And we need to know for sure where those places are at. When we know what the basins are going to look like over the next 10, 20, 30 years, part of a water plan is doing things to offset those uses. Using conservation in this state, doing water reuse in a big way, taking wastewater and reusing it and putting it back in the basin that you got it from, and things like that. So, I mean, those are all technologies that are out there and well known about, and we're not turning over new ground on any of that. So, my biggest fear would be is we go secure the next Boeing, and we put it in the wrong place in this state, and they get the permit, but then we find out the well goes dry, or there's just not enough water in that basin. We missed it. That's an embarrassment this state doesn't want, I don't think so.
Thank you. And Jeff Penland from Santee Cooper. Besides us trying to start the wine and beer economic development in the state, tell me from Santee Cooper's perspective what it will mean if we do not have a statewide plan, and how that affects what you do with Santee Cooper.
Yep, and I guess tying it back to the whiskey, I think one of the blessings we have in South Carolina, Senator Burden mentioned it earlier in the earlier session, is South Carolina is blessed with water. There are other areas of our country where that's not the case, and they're fighting over water, and they're drinking whiskey. And thankfully, as Mr. Winkle said, we haven't had anyone in South Carolina, to my knowledge, be denied a permit to withdraw surface water. So despite the concern for it, I do think that we've made very good proactive steps in that regard. I think the drought from 2007 certainly woke us up in that regard, but we're in a position, I think, where we can plan for future water use in South Carolina, and that's what the surface water legislation helps with, as well as our other water regulatory processes. For Santee Cooper, why that's important is through that legislation, we're able to maintain what we have and plan to be able to use what we have going forward, which was an important step for us in that process, as well as establish what we thought was a fair and balanced system for future water requirements. So we feel like the process for potential new withdrawals is there under that legislation, and South Carolina, in my opinion, is forward thinking in that regard. On the economic development side, we are hoping that there are future permits applied for surface water withdrawals from water bodies, and I totally agree with Dyke that we need our economic developers involved in this process, tracking on water use, so that in the future they're going to know where there are constraints for water and where there are not. But as everyone's said here, the starting point there is to know what's there. As Representative Hyatt said, we have to know what we have, and Santee Cooper, I think, just hopes that we continue to take a balanced approach to it and support economic development going forward in that regard.
And Mr. Cassis from SCE&G, we crossed some similar paths in the past. I was a local government planner for the city of Charleston, and then was a planner for Greenville County. And in those times, you didn't go out after 5 o'clock, or you'd bring your dinner in if you had a 7 o'clock meeting. And it was the same thing in Greenville. And being the optimistic planner I was, when you would look at West Greenville, I'd say, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I'll keep working on it, but you know, I also didn't have a sense of direction, so that's that's what happened there. But it goes back to planning takes a long time, and it's not. It serves no purpose if it is just something that is put together for no good reason. And again, I'd like to ask you the question about the importance of the statewide plan, given all of the planning that goes on within South Carolina electric and gas, as well as in the electrical and water utility industries.
Sure. Yeah, the statewide plan it's important, and I think all the utilities up here will tell you the same thing. By our very nature, we've got to be planners. Mm-hmm. So each of us, as we have our resource plans, they're built on contingencies and redundancies. The greater the certainty we've got in the inputs, the better our plans are. But David said it best. He said, at the end of the day, the consumer drives what we do. I know for a fact I'm in a customer relations business. I manage call centers and business offices, and you got to keep the lights on. got to keep the service at the level that people wanted. It's got to be reliable. That's most important. It helps when the inputs are valid and good. I'm not a pessimist, so I'm 52, not 87. So I'm going to take the contrarian point. I think we do plan. I think the thing is, you don't plan all of our resource plans. When you look at the 10 and the 20-year mark, they become less clear. But at 5 years, I mean, I'll give you maybe the greatest example that I know of right now in South Carolina is that we're building a nuclear plant. You don't build those on 5 and 10-year horizons. You build those, and so as Jeff and our partners on that plant, you got to look forward. So there's a case where we're investing some huge capital dollars into ultimately what ends up being a really good outcome for South Carolina. Granted, it's a painful process at the point that you're asking consumers to pay for it. But at the end result ends up being something that I think people are going to be really happy with. But you got to get there first.
Thank you. And Mr. Jeff Lineberger from, let's see, I know where you're from. You're from Duke Power, my neck of the woods. And everybody else is, except for these guys. Tell me, in your mind, I know that you've talked about a lot of the work that your organization has been doing in terms of planning for the future, and we've heard the importance of that and how you just don't go forward with this sort of industry and this many customers without a plan. What impact would not having or does not having a state plan for you to go by with the protocols in place, what does that mean for your company?
Well, Donna, one of the concerns is a bit of a technical one, but in South Carolina with the Surface Water Withdrawal Use and Permitting Act, it provides the regulatory guidance to South Carolina DHEC for how they're going to make decisions on issuing those permits. If you were an existing withdrawer, you got your permit automatically. You got it. That was part of the protection that was built into legislation. DHEC is going to have to make decisions, though, on new proposals that are aimed at protecting this thing called safe yield of the water resource. That is a term of the water supply industry that the electric industry has come to grips with as well, but there's a lot of different ways to determine safe yield. In a lake system in particular, some would say safe yield of that reservoir is how much water you can take out of it until the first dock becomes unusable, the first boat dock becomes unusable. Then you've reached safe yield. Others would say it's the amount of water you can take out until the first public launch ramp becomes unusable. The definition that Duke has adopted through its permitting process, or its permitting processes and our planning processes, is we call it water yield, not safe yield, but it's how much water can you safely take out of that system and not uncover a power plant's intake or a public water supply's intake or a large industrial intake. It's those things. Because the thinking being, in that worst case, long-term kind of drought, you got to set priorities. And on the agriculture end, they're not specifically in there, but we don't have a lot of agriculture intakes on our reservoirs. And also with lots of agricultural facilities, they're more flexible than some of these big, huge concrete structures are, so you can actually move them out into the reservoir to get to deeper water. So, David, I'm not neglecting the agricultural part of that. But what I'm getting to here is it's not been defined yet how DHEC is actually going to determine safe yield. Reason being is that the first new public water withdrawal intake permit proposal has not come in. It's not been done. So there's a regulatory framework in place that's not tested right now. We really need that state level plan to help give some guidance to how you determine safe yield. And one last thing that we shouldn't forget, you initially asked about, how are things different from 2008? There was a whole different feeling in this room in 2008. Reason being, most of both states, most of both North and South Carolina, were suffering through the second year of what was the new drought record. We had all been through white knuckle time when we were worried about our power plants staying online. Our company was. And we were able to avoid what could have been a much different outcome for North and South Carolina by having a plan in place to manage drought and knowing what the others that are using that water resource are going to be withdrawing and what we can do together to protect the resource. We will survive without one. We got to have one to get better.
Well, I want to thank all of you. We have run out of time. I still have plenty of other questions, and so I may grab you at some point and particularly get back to, well, I'm going to blame Mr. Spencer for bringing up I shouldn't blame you. I want to congratulate you for bringing up the idea of other potential options for funding, but we will take that at another day or perhaps later today. And I want to thank you for joining us for this continuing conversation with the panelists from the South Carolina Water Resources Conference. Thank you very much. And thank you, gentlemen.